I am the nurse who heard the child gasping for breath in the middle of the night. The boy's new stepmother stood beside him, her hand lifted as if ready to strike, and I made only one phone call, just one, but it changed everything, because I called the boy's father, the most powerful and feared man on the eastern seaboard, the one person who should never have discovered his wife's secret. Elena Brooks jolted upright from the small chair in the corner, the moment the ragged wheeze rose from the little bed near the window. The clock on the wall pointed to exactly 12:15 in the morning, rain whispering steadily against the glass walkway outside, in a rhythm so bleak it sent a shiver down her spine. She rushed to the bedside, her heart pounding as she saw Lucas Morgan's pale face, his tiny chest rising in weak, uneven breaths, his lips already turning a dusky blue. She bent low, pressing her ear to his chest, hearing the liquid crackle deep inside his lungs, a sound she had prayed never to encounter again after her years as an emergency room nurse. No test was needed. Elena knew with chilling certainty that the boy was slipping into acute respiratory failure caused by a failing heart. She reached for the emergency button mounted beside the bed, but froze when the door clicked open. Soft footsteps light, feline crossed the polished wooden floor. Sienna Morgan, the boss's newly wedded wife of barely 8 months, glided into the room in a black silk robe, her blonde hair sleeked into a tight knot, her face empty of expression. Her eyes swept the room and stopped at the sight of Lucas struggling for breath. "Still alive," she exhaled, her voice flat and cold as melting ice. Elena retreated partly behind the medicine cabinet, her hands trembling as Sienna walked toward the bed with no sense of urgency at all. Those pale hands reached out and seized the small amber prescription bottle the medication required for the very episode threatening Lucas's life. "Sienna," Elena whispered, horror trembling in her voice. Sienna turned, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Not your concern," she said, slipping the bottle into her robe pocket before stepping back. "He needs that medication. He can't breathe," Elena said, moving to stand between Sienna and the child. "I know," Sienna murmured with a smile. "That is the intention." Elena's breath caught. In an instant, she spun and slammed her hand against the emergency button on the wall. Nothing. No light. No sound. She tried again. "Useless. You think I don't know what that button does?" Sienna said, stepping closer and swiping her phone screen. Security switched shifts. No doctor on call. The alert system is temporarily disconnected. "You're killing a child," Elena choked out, backing toward the bed where Lucas had begun to twitch in small, frightening spasms. "Not every child is meant to live," Sienna said with a shrug. "Some of them are just burdens." Elena hesitated no longer. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed the one number every staff member in the mansion had been instructed to call only in matters of life and death. The line picked up after 3 rings. A man's deep, dry voice answered. "Brooks?" Elena inhaled sharply, fear splintering her words, but every syllable cut with clarity. "Lucas isn't breathing, and your wife, she took all his medication. She intends to kill him." A dead silence filled the line. Then the voice returned, lower and more lethal than any weapon Elena had ever seen on a battlefield. "Keep him alive. I am coming home." The call ended. Elena gripped Lucas's tiny hand, feeling his pulse weakening beneath her fingers. "Your father is coming," she whispered. "Hold on, Lucas. You have to hold on. And if you are hearing this now and feel something in your chest stir some ache, some memory, some truth, take 1 moment to subscribe to our channel. Like the video and share it so we can continue bringing stories like this to you every day. And if you don't mind, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know where in the world this story has reached. We cherish every single line you share. Caleb Morgan stood in a conference room on the 43rd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, where the walls were perfectly soundproofed and warm gold lighting spilled across a long walnut table. He was not the kind of man who allowed his phone to ring during a meeting, especially not while negotiating with one of the most volatile partners on the East Coast, but when he saw Elena Brooks's name flash across the screen, a cold premonition sliced down his spine. Elena had never called him at this hour, had never called without a dire reason. Caleb excused himself, voice low and taut, stepped onto the wind-sealed balcony, and shut the door behind him before lifting the phone to his ear. The moment he heard Elena's trembling words, his entire body went rigid, pulled tight like steel wire pushed to its breaking point. "Lucas is not breathing. Sienna took his medication. She intends to kill him. 3 sentences, each one carving into him like a blade. The noise behind him faded, the murmured voices, the polished table, the city lights shimmering below, all collapsing into a single truth. His son was lying on the threshold between life and death. "Elena, get him out of the room," Caleb said, his voice dropping to something almost inhuman. "Lock the door. Do not let anyone inside." "I am on my way," Elena answered between panting breaths. "Sienna is blocking me. The emergency button isn't working. The alarms are disabled. I'm afraid she'll harm him before I can move him." Caleb did not respond right away. Elena heard his breath hard, sharp not from fear but from a fury so primal she felt it scorch through the phone. She had never heard him like this, but she sensed that his rage alone could burn down a city. "Listen to me," Caleb said, enunciating every word slowly, deeply, with a coldness that chilled her marrow. "Keep Lucas beside you. Do not let him out of your sight. If Sienna touches him again, you protect him by any means necessary." It would take Caleb roughly 40 minutes to return home, but Elena knew he would break every traffic law in the state to cut that time in half. A faint noise from Lucas's room made her flinch. She peered through a narrow gap and saw Sienna circling the bed, her hand still tucked into the robe pocket where she'd hidden the boy's medication. Elena pressed the phone tight to her ear and whispered, "She's still here. He's breathing worse. I don't know how long he can last." Caleb's voice broke just slightly, and for the first time Elena heard genuine fear in the man who had built an empire on being untouchable. "Don't let him die, Elena. Don't let him be alone. I'm begging you." Behind Caleb, someone knocked on the conference room door. One of the powerful men attending the meeting asked whether he would be returning soon. Caleb turned, looking at the room through the glass, then at the steel-colored night sky. Walking away now might destroy a $100 million agreement and ignite conflict between multiple organizations across the region. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered besides Lucas. Nothing. Caleb spoke into the phone, his voice nearly a vow. "Elena, keep my son alive until I get there. I don't care how. Just keep him breathing." Then he ended the call, left the meeting, left the stunned and furious faces behind him, and ran out of the building as if the world itself would collapse if he arrived home 1 second too late. Caleb Morgan hurled himself into the car like a force of nature, and the moment the engine ignited, his foot slammed down on the accelerator, sending the black SUV tearing out of the underground garage like a hunted beast. In his ears, Elena's voice still echoed like an unending curse. Lucas is not breathing. And his wife, the woman he once trusted enough to place his name beside hers on a marriage certificate, had taken the only thing keeping his little boy alive. Streetlights slashed past the windshield like blades, but all Caleb could see in his mind was the image of Lucas as a newborn, so tiny that Caleb's hand could almost cover the boy's entire body. That had been the last day of his first wife, Rachel. She had smiled when her frail fingers brushed his cheek, then closed her eyes forever. Lucas entered the world through the greatest loss Caleb had ever known, and from that day on, he lived for one purpose: protecting his son. He had never been a gentle man, and years in the underworld of financial crime had hardened his heart beyond stone. But when Lucas first fell ill, barely 4 months old, with a heart too small to sustain him, Caleb had dropped to his knees beside the hospital crib. He did not pray, and he did not cry. He simply stripped away every layer of power he wore like armor, and let his heart tremble before the fragile life that depended on him. He refused to hire any caregiver without medical training, brought in a rotating team of doctors to monitor Lucas around the clock, and installed a biological surveillance system in the boy's bedroom as if it were a miniature intensive care unit. The sprawling mansion of more than 1,000 square meters on the outskirts of Long Island had become a quiet fortress built solely for Lucas until Sienna appeared. Caleb met her at a charity gala hosted by the bank, where she wore a wine-red dress and stood among the crowd like a rose with hidden thorns. Her voice carried a faint French lilt, and her eyes had a way of looking at a person just long enough to make them believe they mattered. After years of living like a machine, Caleb found himself softened by her careful kindnesses, her perfectly timed sympathy, and the gentle way she pretended to adore Lucas. They married 6 months after their first meeting so quickly that even Caleb's closest associates found it strange. But he had thought, perhaps Lucas needed the image of a mother, and perhaps he himself could not live forever shackled to the past. Elena Brooks was hired as Lucas's private nurse 2 months after the wedding. She came from Texas, had been an emergency room nurse for 8 years before resigning due to a personal incident she never spoke about. She was quiet, meticulous, and kept an impeccable professional distance from everyone in the house, everyone except Lucas. The boy took to her instantly, and Caleb noticed that every time Elena was near, Lucas coughed less, hurt less, smiled more. It made him believe that at least one choice in his long line of mistakes had been the right one. But the moment Sienna fully moved into the mansion, small shifts began to creep into the air. Lucas woke at night, coughing violently for no clear reason. The alarm system occasionally shut down without warning. Prescription bottles, once consistent, began appearing with different labels. Elena mentioned these things lightly, cautiously, as though merely observing, never accusing. But Caleb, torn between trust and instinct, chose silence, because he wanted to believe he could not have been so wrong, that he had not placed a predator under the same roof as his vulnerable child. Now, there was nothing left to doubt, no room for blind faith, no time for regret. He glanced at the clock. Nearly 30 minutes until he could reach the estate, if nothing slowed him down. Yet inside him, a cold voice whispered relentlessly. What if he did not make it in time? What if Lucas slipped away before he crossed the threshold? Caleb tightened his grip on the steering wheel. No. He would make it, at any cost. He had to. Before Caleb ever realized something was wrong, Sienna had rooted herself into every corner of his life. She knew precisely when to appear, what tone to speak in, which wound to soothe. On nights when he came home from endless negotiations in windowless rooms, she waited for him with candlelight, a glass of wine, and soft, glistening eyes. On nights when he stayed awake as Lucas battled a fever, she sat quietly beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispering words of comfort, telling him it wasn't his fault, that Lucas was strong, that Rachel would be smiling from somewhere above. She never asked for anything. She never requested jewelry or hinted at exotic trips, never meddled in business. And it was precisely this lack of demands that convinced Caleb her heart was generous. Gradually, she was allowed into his private home office, granted access to internal systems, included at corporate events as his second representative. No one dared object. She was his wife, and if Caleb Morgan, a man whose name alone commanded fear, accepted her, then no subordinate had the right to question it. But Elena was not a subordinate. She belonged to a different category entirely, observers. And from very early on, Elena had noticed the cracks in Sienna's perfect mask. Some nights, checking the medication, Elena found bottles replaced. The labels, dosages, pill colors, all identical, but her instincts screamed otherwise. An emergency room nurse knows the difference between real and counterfeit medicine, even at a fraction of a percentage. When she asked the supply manager, she was told simply that the missus requested a cheaper brand. Another night, at 3 a.m, Lucas's heart monitor registered abnormal readings, but when she checked the stored data, the recording from that window had mysteriously corrupted. The technical team blamed an automatic software update, a glitch that occasionally erased logs, but the glitch happened only when Lucas showed signs of respiratory distress, and only when Sienna was the one beside him. Elena began forming silent questions in her mind, but she spoke none of them aloud. She had no proof. No one would believe her. And if she was wrong, if she cast suspicion without evidence, she would be the one forced out of the estate, not Sienna. Caleb had never been unkind to her, but he had never opened his heart either. He kept a respectful distance, showed appreciation through bonuses and professionalism, but never asked her opinion of Sienna, never asked her to observe anything beyond Lucas's health. Elena understood that he was trying to rebuild a home. After so much loss, perhaps he needed to believe in something, even if it was a lie. But small fractures never remain small. One October afternoon, with sunlight drifting softly through Lucas's curtains, Elena caught Sienna watching him. It was not the look of a concerned stepmother. It was cold, distant, calculating. Sienna stood behind the glass, believing unseen, but Elena saw, and it was enough for her to know that the unease inside her did not come from suspicion, but from a truth not yet uncovered. And in that moment, she realized, if anything ever happened to Lucas, the only person standing between him and the abyss would not be his father, nor the doctors, but her, the one person unmoved by perfect smiles and sweet embraces, the one person who did not believe in the mask, called Caleb Morgan's wife. That afternoon, when the sunlight had begun to thin at the far end of the long hallway, Elena stepped into Lucas's room for his daily check. The boy was propped against his pillows, his breathing raspy but his face stretched into an effortful little smile to convince her he was fine, though Elena had always known Lucas was sharper and more perceptive than most children his age, and today there was something different in his eyes, as if he were holding a secret far too heavy for an 8-year-old to carry. She sat down beside him, adjusted the thin oxygen tube across his small nose, and asked in a voice soft as a passing breeze, "Lucas, sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the door as though afraid someone might hear, then whispered, "Miss Elena, I want to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anybody. Please." Elena nodded slowly, offering a promise without pressure but with the weight of truth behind it. Lucas swallowed hard, his little hand tightening on the edge of the blanket. "She doesn't like me." Elena felt her heartbeat catch, but she kept her tone calm. "Who doesn't?" Lucas lowered his eyes to his feet, his voice barely more than air. "Mother Sienna." Elena placed her hand over his cold, trembling fingers, feeling the fear of a child who had been living in silence far too long. "Tell me, sweetheart, what happened?" Lucas looked up, his wide brown eyes clouded with worry. "She comes into my room when Dad isn't home. She thinks I'm asleep, but I'm not asleep all the time. She takes my medicine, and—" He paused for a long, aching moment before releasing the words as though lifting stones off his chest. "She says I'm a burden." A chill slid over Elena's skin. Lucas reached up to touch his throat, demonstrating with a small gesture what words could not fully carry. "One time she squeezed me here, really hard, and said if I couldn't breathe, then maybe that's just fate." His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't tell Dad because he'd be sad. He's already sad all the time." Elena's throat tightened, anger winding through her chest, not loud but sharp, like a wire drawn tight enough to cut. Children did not lie the way adults did, and Lucas least of all. She edged her chair closer, her voice steady and firm. "Lucas, you did the right thing telling me. I'm here to protect you. But I need to know something important. Have you ever seen her do anything to your medicine?" Lucas nodded faintly. "Once, I saw her open my medicine drawer, take a bottle, and put it in her pocket. When she left, I checked, and the label looked different. Not like the others." He paused, then said the sentence Elena would never forget. "I think she's trying to switch my medicine with something that makes me weaker, so Dad won't know." Elena froze. Her breath held still. Every suspicion she had carried, every odd detail she had catalogued, fell suddenly into place, forming a terrifying and undeniable picture. Sienna was not simply manipulating Caleb. She had intentions toward Lucas, deliberate in every calculated shift, every glitch in the surveillance system, every replaced bottle. Elena knew she could not wait for evidence to fall into her hands. She had to find it herself. That night, once Lucas was asleep, she wrapped a thin coat around her shoulders and slipped down the hallway toward the medical storage room. With the instincts of her emergency room years guiding her, she inspected each bottle, each label, each serial number. Then she found it something no one could call coincidence. A bottle identical to Lucas's, but its expiration date scrubbed faintly away, and the ingredients inside completely mismatched with the doctor's prescription. Elena's heartbeat pounded like a fist against her ribs. She tucked the bottle into her pocket, closed the cabinet, and stepped backward into the shadows just as the sharp click of heels echoed down the corridor Sienna's heels. Elena stood still, breath suspended, her hospital-honed instincts whispering that she had crossed into a battle far larger than anything she had faced before. And one thing was certain. If she did not act, Lucas would not survive much longer. She kept the bottle clenched in her hand the entire walk back to her room, her pulse racing like a war drum. She had her first piece of evidence, small but irrefutable. Sienna did not merely want control. She wanted Lucas gone. And now, perhaps the time for subtlety had passed. When Elena entered Lucas's room, she found him sleeping restlessly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, his breath short and heavy. She took his temperature 40 degrees. His heart rate had spiked, his blood pressure had dropped. She immediately called the on-call doctor, but no one answered. Every internal extension rang dead, blood drained from her face. She prepared her emergency kit, administered temporary fever reducers and cardiac stabilizers, then rushed into the hallway to find help. The mansion, normally staffed with 2 backup nurses and 1 attending physician, had become deserted. The hallway lights were dimmer than usual, no longer the warm gold glow but a sterile, icy white. A shiver clawed up her spine. When she returned to Lucas's room, Sienna stood directly in front of the door. She wore a pearl-colored silk dress, her hair pinned into a perfect knot, her face flawless yet her eyes dark as the bottom of a well. "Where are you going, Elena?" she asked softly, her voice deceptively airy, but something beneath it made Elena's skin crawl. "I'm looking for a doctor. Lucas has a high fever and no one is on shift." Sienna tilted her head slightly, studying Elena the way a predator studies prey. "Today they all have the day off. Strange, isn't it?" Elena steadied her voice. "I found a counterfeit bottle in storage. Someone might be trying to—" "Really?" Sienna interrupted. "What a coincidence." She stepped closer and, swift as a serpent, slipped her hand into Elena's coat pocket, retrieving the bottle without blinking. "You think you've done something meaningful?" Elena grabbed it back, her voice steel. "I'm telling Mr. Caleb." Sienna laughed, a hollow sound without tone, as though drifting from somewhere far away. "He won't believe you. Who are you?" "A nameless nurse from nowhere." "And me? I'm his wife." Elena positioned herself between Sienna and Lucas's door, her hand closing around her phone, but there was no time to dial. Sienna reached into the folds of her dress and produced a small vial filled with a colorless liquid, twisting the cap off as she tilted her head thoughtfully. "I plan to let the boy weaken slowly, slip away in his sleep. But since you insist on interfering, perhaps it must be quicker." Elena backed up 1 step, and at that exact moment, the lights snapped off. Everything plunged into darkness. She spun to open Lucas's door, only to find it locked from the outside. She pounded on it, calling his name, but no answer came. When she turned again, Sienna had vanished. Elena sprinted down the stairs, racing through the corridor toward the technical room where the electrical and security systems were controlled, but the panel was dead. The entire system had been switched to manual emergency mode, a mode only Caleb or Sienna had authorization for. Her breath came fast and shallow, her thoughts spinning, and she realized she had only one option left: break down Lucas's door. She ran back upstairs, heart pounding, kicked open the supply closet, grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher, and charged at the door. Each strike sent metallic echoes down the hallway, and in her mind she saw only one image: Lucas's small, trembling face as he whispered, "If I can't breathe, maybe that's just fate." The door gave way on the 13th blow, and inside she found Lucas unconscious on the bed, his lips bluish, his limbs twitching faintly. On the bedside table sat a cup of water still warm with steam, and on the floor lay a half-dissolved tablet. Elena rushed forward and pressed her fingers to his carotid artery. His pulse was there, but terrifyingly fast and thready, fluttering like a trapped bird. He wasn't dead yet, but he was drowning in his own lungs. She immediately tilted his head back to clear his airway, injecting a dose of temporary adrenaline into his arm to keep his heart from giving out, her voice breaking as she called his name. "Lucas, come on, sweetheart, don't give up. Your dad is on his way." She did not see Sienna anywhere, only the sharp, cloying sweetness of her perfume lingering in the air, and the relentless tick of the clock repeating like a cruel reminder that time was running out. Elena continued pressing down on Lucas's chest, each compressing beat beneath her palms fading like the flame of a candle nearing its end, and she bent low, pressing her ear to his ribs, searching for even the faintest echo of life. Suddenly, a tiny moan slipped from his lips, so soft an ordinary person might have missed it, but to Elena, it was more precious than anything in the world. She quickly injected a dose of temporary adrenaline into the muscle of his upper arm, then fitted the oxygen mask back over his delicate nose. There was only one choice left. She had to get him out of this house as fast as she possibly could. She could not wait for Caleb. She could no longer trust the mansion's systems. And she certainly could not give Sienna a second chance to finish what she had already begun. Elena wrapped Lucas in a thin blanket, carefully avoiding the IV line and the portable oxygen tank, then lifted him with every ounce of strength she had. He was light, so heartbreakingly light, but the fear weighing on her shoulders made every step feel like she was dragging an entire building behind her. She knew she could not use the main entrance, nor any hallway if Sienna had disabled the medical systems. She had almost certainly tampered with the cameras and the doors. Only one route remained, something Elena had once heard about in passing but never imagined she would have to use: the underground passage. She remembered a moment when Caleb had toured the mansion with the fire inspection team, and an old firefighter had tapped the metal floor panel behind the wine cellar, joking that if Mr. Morgan ever wanted to disappear from the world, all he had to do was step down there. Elena knew that route led to an abandoned structure at the edge of the woods, once a Cold War shelter forgotten by time. She hurried through the kitchen, down the hallway to the cellar, breath hitching as her arms trembled from exhaustion and fear. Holding Lucas close, feeling his shallow breaths against her chest, she shoved aside the heavy wine rack, revealing the dust-covered metal hatch beneath it. She lifted it, and the smell of damp earth and rust rushed upward. The staircase below was narrow and pitch black. Elena had no time left for fear. She pressed Lucas to her chest, one arm cradling him, the other gripping the rail as she descended the slippery steps, as though climbing down into the earth itself. The air thickened as she went deeper, cold, stale, heavy. The weak glow of her phone's flashlight illuminated only a few steps ahead. The corridor twisted like a maze, its concrete walls mottled with old stains of moisture and mold. Her footsteps echoed through the tight space, mingling with the faint hiss of Lucas's oxygen tank. Each time the hiss paused for even a heartbeat, her own heart lurched. She spoke softly as she walked, as if her words alone might tether Lucas to life. "Hold on, Lucas. Just a little more, sweetheart. I'm not letting this end like this. Not tonight." Then, from above, a sound of faint but unmistakable thud echoed down the tunnel, the sound of a door being opened. Elena immediately shut off her light, pressed herself and Lucas against the cold wall, holding him so tightly she could feel his tiny heartbeat flutter against her ribs. Footsteps paced the wine cellar above, slow and deliberate. A familiar voice, cold enough to frost over stone, drifted downward, dragging each word with chilling patience. "I know where you are, Elena. That passage won't take you far. Sienna." Elena bit down on her lip, her hand closing around the small knife she kept in her coat pocket, not to attack, but to defend if she had no choice. But fighting was not her goal. Escape was. Saving Lucas was. When the footsteps faded, she moved deeper into the tunnel. Nearly 200 meters later, she reached a rusted steel door, leaning her shoulder into it 3 times before the latch gave way. A dim flicker from an old tube light illuminated the cement floor of the abandoned structure. Beyond the door lay the forest. She pushed through the overgrown brush and tangled roots, the sharp smell of decaying leaves filling her lungs, but she did not slow down. A neglected security outpost lay less than a 5-minute walk away. She prayed it still had cell reception. Her hands trembling, she unlocked her phone, one single bar of signal. It was enough. She called Caleb without hesitation. The instant he answered, she didn't waste a second. Her voice shook with urgency. "I'm outside. Lucas is alive. But we don't have much time. Sienna knows." Caleb spoke only one sentence before ending the call, his voice like a blade. "Keep my son safe." "I'm coming." Elena tightened her arms around Lucas, tears slipping down her face without her realizing. She had pulled him from the edge of death, but deep inside she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. And while Elena disappeared into the night, Sienna slammed her hand onto the wine cellar table so hard the glass shattered, her eyes glowing red in the dim light of the storage room. No more disguises, no more sweetness or tolerance. The face that had once enchanted Caleb had dissolved, leaving behind only coldness and bloodlust. She pulled a small device from her pocket, tapping the red button 3 times. A short beep echoed through the security system, and instantly every camera in the mansion shifted to the external perimeter, deliberately blinding the interior view. Swiftly, she pulled out her phone, dialed a preset number, and spoke in a clipped, decisive tone. "Phase 2 is active. Confirmed target is fleeing the estate. Priority is retrieving the hard drive first. Handle the woman if necessary." The reply was a curt, wordless acknowledgement, a sound of men, accustomed to violence. Only 15 minutes later, a small white utility truck with an electrical maintenance logo pulled up to the western side gate. 4 men in technician uniforms stepped out, carrying heavy tool cases. The gate guard hesitated at first, but when the lead man produced a security card identical to the estate's own and spoke in a thick southern drawl about an emergency blackout reported by headquarters, the guard faltered long enough to let them pass. Their pace was steady but deliberate. They were not electricians. They were mercenaries, professionals from a covert faction allied with Sienna, the kind of men summoned only when a problem needed to be erased without leaving traces. Meanwhile, in the abandoned building where Elena had surfaced with Lucas, night had wrapped itself around the forest, and the air was growing colder. She could not stop to rest. She knew it would not take long for Sienna to discover the tunnel had been used and to track the escape route. Elena tried to keep Lucas conscious by murmuring softly to him, occasionally brushing her fingers against his warm forehead to soothe him, though he drifted in and out of exhaustion. Less than half an hour later, just as Elena feared, one of the disguised mercenaries spotted the dislodged hatch behind the wine cellar. A sharp whistle pierced the air, and the group split apart, 2 heading into the underground passage, the other 2 into the woods. Back at the mansion, Sienna stood in the central control room, her gaze fixed on the perimeter monitors. Her hand rested lightly on the small handgun tucked in a drawer beside her, next to a sleek black hard drive containing classified data Caleb never realized had been copied behind his back. She knew that to keep her power and her life she had to ensure Lucas was never found, and even more importantly, that no one ever uncovered the mirrored records of Caleb's dealings with rival factions across the region. That hard drive was the only insurance protecting her if everything collapsed. And now, Lucas's continued existence threatened all of it. Caleb was nearing the outskirts of the estate, the streetlights blurring through the misty drizzle streaking across his windshield. A coded message from his personal security chief appeared on his screen. Unidentified personnel approaching through the west gate. Security system rerouted. Caleb's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. He recognized this pattern, recognized it all too well. There was only one person bold enough to override his private security protocols without permission: Sienna. Without hesitation, he called Leo, leader of his elite protection team, commanding him to deploy the tactical response unit to the mansion within 10 minutes and to initiate a full data lockdown. Leo replied with 2 words, sharp as steel: understood. In the forest, Elena heard the sound, a rustle too heavy to be wildlife, too controlled to be the wind. Footsteps, human. She lifted Lucas and darted toward the narrow northern path leading to the old guard station. Her heart pounded until her ribs ached, but she didn't stop. She knew that if they caught her before Caleb arrived, not only Lucas but she herself would disappear, swallowed without a trace. And she also knew that to the men Sienna had summoned, human life was merely a footnote in a plan written long before tonight. Caleb tore out of downtown Manhattan like a storm made of steel, the high-pressure lamps sweeping across his windshield and carving sharp bands of light over his tense, focused face. The road back to the estate had never felt this long. Each passing second dragged across him like the point of a clock hand driving into flesh. Elena's voice replayed in his mind, every fractured word, every ragged breath. Lucas is still alive, but Sienna knows. He tightened his grip on the wheel, the heel of his shoe driving hard into the accelerator. The engine roared, the taillights trailing a long red streak through the darkness. Just as he turned onto the forest road that led home, a piercing screech tore through the car, an alert flashing that something sharp had struck the front left tire. Caleb slowed instinctively, but before he could react, the entire vehicle lurched sideways, the tire collapsing in a violent hiss as the SUV skidded into the damp dirt shoulder. A soft pop ignited near the gas tank. This was no accident. It was an ambush. Caleb immediately drew the concealed handgun from the console, rolled from the driver's seat, and slid behind the rear bumper for cover. A gray, unmarked SUV burst from the tree line and blocked the road ahead. 3 men dressed in black stepped out, silent, calm, moving in a coordinated, military formation. 2 fanned out to flank him, while the third approached with a signal jammer in his grip. When he activated it, all communication within 50 meters died instantly. Caleb recognized immediately these were not amateurs, and Sienna had prepared for the possibility he would not stand still. He pivoted against the SUV, fired once, and hit the lead man in the leg. The man crumpled without a cry, but the other 2 reacted with ruthless efficiency. A burst of gunfire hammering into the metal beside him, sparks flashing like flint in the night. Caleb used the split-second opening, dove into the forest, and vanished behind the tall pines. The 2 men gave chase, but Caleb knew every shortcut, every ridge, every hidden path. He did not need to lead a criminal empire to know how to stay alive. He only needed to be a father. A memory flickered sharply through his mind. 3 months earlier, Sienna had asked him about the signal jammers he forbade anywhere near the mansion, claiming she wanted to prevent cyber attacks. He had feigned agreement, but a primal warning bell had gone off in his mind. That very night, he had instructed Leo to install a dormant mirror on her private server. For months, her data had been locked behind military-grade encryption that Leo was struggling to crack, leaving them waiting for a slip-up. But now, every odd detail snapped into place. She had not only lied, she had been preparing for this night for a very long time, and he had walked straight into her trap. The rushed marriage, her gradual control over the security systems, the questionable contracts she insisted he sign in his absence. Even today's meeting timed so precisely to pull him away just as danger struck. None of it was coincidence. It was a plan. Caleb halted beside an abandoned guard post nestled deep in the woods and pulled out the spare phone hidden inside the emergency kit. The device operated on an independent signal, enough to reach Leo. The moment the line connected, Leo's voice snapped through. "Report." Caleb breathed hard. "Ambushed. 1 down, 2 pursuing. They used a jammer." "Sienna has an inside source. Security is compromised. Send a team northeast. Use the back route. I suspect the hard drive has been taken and is being moved." Leo asked no questions, only confirmed the tactical team was en route. Caleb pocketed the phone, drew a deep breath, and pushed through the dense brush again, every step deliberate and steady. He could not afford to be caught. He could not allow them to reach Lucas. He could not leave Elena fighting alone. This was no longer about power or reputation. This was a battle for his family, and Caleb Morgan had never lost when the stakes were this high. Caleb didn't head toward the mansion. The glow of the estate was a trap, and he knew Elena was no longer inside those walls. Instead, he veered sharp left, tearing through the dense underbrush toward the coordinates of the old Cold War structure. Elena had described the endpoint of the tunnel. His lungs burned, branches whipping against his face, but the fear of arriving too late pushed him faster than he had ever run in his life. He saw the looming silhouette of the concrete outpost just ahead, dark and silent against the trees. He approached the rusted steel door, his gun raised. "Elena," he called out, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the wind. "It's me." "Open the door." Inside, there was a beat of terrified silence, followed by the scraping sound of a heavy metal bar being lifted. The door creaked open just a fraction, and Caleb shoved his way inside, immediately locking it behind him. The beam of his flashlight cut through the damp, moldy air and landed on the corner of the room. Elena was huddled on the floor, her body curved protectively over Lucas, a small knife trembling in her hand. When the light hit Caleb's face, the knife clattered to the concrete. She didn't speak. She simply collapsed forward, her strength finally giving out. Caleb dropped to his knees, holstering his weapon and pulling both of them into a fierce embrace. Lucas was shivering violently, his skin burning with fever, but he was breathing. "I've got you," Caleb whispered into Elena's hair, his hand gripping Lucas's small shoulder, as if to anchor the boy to the earth. "I'm here. Sienna sent men," Elena choked out, grabbing Caleb's coat. "They are in the woods. They're hunting us." "I know," Caleb said, his eyes hardening as he looked at the thin steel door. It wouldn't hold for long. He could already hear the snap of twigs and heavy footsteps closing in outside. The mercenaries were circling the perimeter. There was no way to run back through the woods without being gunned down. "We can't go back out there," Caleb said, his voice turning into the cold steel of a commander. He looked around the small outpost. It was just a shell, but he remembered the blueprints. This wasn't just an exit, it was an airlock for the deeper shelter below. "We have to go down, deeper." He guided them toward the heavy blast door at the rear of the outpost, leading to the deeper reinforced bunker. The steel door clanged shut behind them, sealing the only exit. The air was tight, heavy with damp earth, their breathing loud in the cramped dark, Lucas's shallow gasps, Elena's trembling breaths, Caleb's steady, controlled fury. He laid Lucas gently on the concrete floor, keeping one protective hand on him, his eyes scanning every inch of the cramped bunker for an escape route. But everything was barricaded. They had been herded here, forced into a trap laid long before tonight. Outside, footsteps gathered no longer distant, but close enough to tremble through the walls. Sienna was leading the disguised mercenaries straight toward them. Caleb felt the tension press into his spine, his heartbeat pounding like war drums, and he understood with chilling clarity. There was no retreat, no negotiation, no illusion left. Only one choice remained: protect his son and find a way out of hell. Lucas's breathing changed, shifting from frantic, rapid gasps to a terrifyingly slow, shallow rattle that scraped against the silence of the bunker. It was the sound of a body giving up. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and his small body went completely limp, his skin draining of all color until it turned a ghostly, waxen shade of gray. Caleb froze, his hand flying to the boy's chest. The heartbeat beneath his palm was no longer a frantic drum. It was a fading flutter, erratic and faint, like a trapped bird running out of air and strength. "Lucas! Stay with me! Don't you dare close your eyes!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking, shaking his son's shoulders gently but with desperate urgency, trying to provoke any reaction. But Lucas hung heavy in his arms, like a doll whose strings had been cut. Elena dropped to her knees, pressing her fingers deep into the soft hollow of the boy's neck, her face pale as the damp concrete walls around them. She waited for a beat, then two, searching for the rhythm of life. "He's slipping into a deep coma," she whispered, the words trembling as they left her lips. She didn't start chest compressions. There was still a pulse, however faint, but she began vigorously rubbing Lucas's cold limbs, trying to stimulate circulation, trying to force his body to remember it needed to be alive. The toxins are shutting down his central nervous system. His heart is too weak to pump efficiently. We don't need CPR yet, but his systems are failing one by one. She looked up at Caleb, tears streaming down her face, but her hands never stopping their work on the boy's arms. "If we don't get him to a hospital in 10 minutes, he won't wake up. His heart will simply stop." Caleb pulled Lucas tighter against his chest, wrapping his own coat around the small body, refusing to accept the creeping coldness seeping into the boy's limbs. He rubbed Lucas's back, his own heart pounding against his ribs, wishing he could transfer his own vitality into his dying son. He didn't need a medical degree to know that life was draining out of Lucas drop by drop, fading into the suffocating dark of the underground. Outside, a heavy thud slammed against the metal door, followed by the screech of iron straining against a crowbar Sienna's men were forcing their way in. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a threat of immediate violence. But Caleb's world had narrowed down to the single, terrifying reality of the fragile, fading pulse under his hand. Caleb laid him carefully on the spare cot in the bunker, keeping a hand on his chest to monitor every rise and fall of breath, when his phone vibrated harshly, the screen flashing in the darkness. The caller was Victor Moretti, his longtime rival and the man behind so many plots designed to break Caleb. Victor's voice came through cold and metallic, saying he knew the estate was in chaos, and now Caleb had to hand over the hard drive or everything would end here, and Caleb knew exactly what that meant. Caleb's grip tightened, rage burning through him, but his voice stayed calm and commanding as he growled that he would hand over nothing, that Lucas was alive and that was the only thing that mattered, and Victor had better not test the limits of a father's fear. Victor laughed softly, the sound slicing through the air like a razor, reminding him that the hard drive held every hidden transaction, every covert alliance, every dark corner of the city's underworld, and refusing to surrender it meant war among the families. Caleb knew that, but the small, fragile body on the cot mattered more than any empire or territory. There was nothing to discuss except keeping his child alive. While Caleb fought to buy time over the phone, the spare device he had retrieved vibrated with an incoming secure connection. Leo, the loyal security expert who had served at his side for years, had bypassed the jammers. Leo's voice cut through the static on the secure phone, breathless but triumphant. "Boss, check the encrypted folder. Remember that back door we planted? When she activated the jammer, tonight, she inadvertently bypassed her own firewall. We're in. I have the evidence. The contract Moretti signed for the hit, all of it digital copies and video. It proves every piece of the conspiracy, including Sienna being hired to eliminate Lucas." Caleb tapped the screen, scrolling rapidly, his pulse hammering in his ears as he saw digital signatures, seals, and timestamps, each file confirming the betrayal had been orchestrated long before tonight. Elena stood behind him, holding Lucas close, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen, feeling the tension coil tighter in the bunker's cold air. Victor, still on the line, pressed harder, counting down minutes, warning that if Caleb did not comply, Not only Lucas but the woman with him would pay the price. This was not a threat, he said, but a promise. Caleb's mouth twisted into a harsh, cold smile. His voice sharpened into steel as he answered that Lucas's life was never going to be bartered with a man like Victor, and he would never surrender. Leo spoke again through the device, confirming the transmission was ready to launch at Caleb's command. Caleb nodded, tension vibrating through him. Every fragile breath Lucas took, reminding him he had no room for delay. Victor snapped back, furious, warning Caleb not to underestimate his power, saying the hard drive could not stay in Caleb's possession forever. Caleb turned to the device and spoke to Leo in a low, steady voice. Do it. They would use the evidence to flip the board, protect the family, and strike before Victor realized the tide had shifted. Leo confirmed instantly. Every file in the encrypted folder would expose the entire plot, shielding Lucas from anything Victor or Sienna could unleash. Caleb placed his hand over Lucas's heart, watching it flutter but still beat, whispering silently that his son would live, that nothing would happen to him. Above them, the noise of engines and distant movement rumbled like a warning, but inside the bunker, Caleb and Elena focused with razor-sharp intensity, aware that the evidence in their hands was the single key that could save Lucas and turn the entire war back on Victor and Sienna. Caleb raised the phone again, addressing Victor for the final time, telling him he would not hand over the hard drive, and that every one of Victor's schemes would be exposed to every family and authority in the city, and if Victor so much as touched a hair on Lucas's head, everything he had built would collapse under Caleb's retaliation. There was a stretch of silence, broken only by Victor's low, lethal exhale, as he warned Caleb he was gambling with lives, but it was already too late, because Leo had placed all the evidence in Caleb's hands, and one command from Caleb could shift the entire game. Caleb leaned down, holding Lucas close against his chest, his eyes cold and unwavering, knowing the balance of power had tipped, and neither Victor nor Sienna could change it now. He stood in the bunker, surrounded by the trembling shadows, holding his son, scanning the room, meeting Elena's wide, frightened eyes and Leo's tense posture, while the undeniable proof glowing on the small screen contracts, logs, and videos capturing Sienna and Victor's treachery rested in his hand. This was the moment. Caleb knew the chance not only to protect his child but to dismantle the entire trap around them. He inhaled deeply, his voice steady and icy as he ordered Leo to send the evidence to every family and every authority who mattered, not just for their protection, but to crush Victor's leverage entirely. Leo nodded, determination burning in his gaze. Elena held Lucas tightly, her hands shaking but strong, finding her strength in Caleb's certainty. Caleb lowered Lucas onto the makeshift cot again, gently rubbing the child's back and whispering softly that he needed to keep breathing, that Papa would take care of everything now. As Leo prepared the transmission, Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the exit and every narrow gap in the bunker door, weighing each sound with the instinct of a man who had survived too many traps to mistake silence for safety. He knew Victor would not sit still. Retaliation would come the moment he realized the evidence had begun to spread. But this was the only move left that could upend every scheme built against them. Caleb raised his phone and contacted the allied families, as well as the factions Victor had once manipulated, his voice low and commanding as he warned them that every plot, every contract for murder, every dark arrangement had now been sent to those with the power to act, and he would take no responsibility for what happened next if Victor dared to push further. Outside, Victor received the flood of messages, watching the evidence circulate simultaneously through channels he thought he controlled, and his face drained of color as the family's long-kept and uneasy balance now had reason to question loyalties and strike preemptively. Caleb watched the confirmation arrive on his screen, each message like a tremor in a fragile alliance. He knew the war had shifted from shadows to open conflict. Elena laid a trembling hand on his shoulder, her voice shaking yet firm as she whispered that they had done it, at least created the chaos they needed. Caleb turned toward Lucas, whose breathing was still frail but slowly evening out, his heartbeat no longer wild but steadying in cautious rhythm, and he felt a brief exhale of relief, knowing the path ahead would be brutal, but they now held the advantage of truth. He instructed Leo to secure every line of communication, to anticipate and neutralize any countermove from Victor or Sienna. The air in the bunker felt thick, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tension pressing in, and Caleb sensed that Victor's retaliation would be swift and merciless, yet he no longer feared it. He had prepared for every scenario, and as long as Lucas was breathing, No threat would bend him. He stood over his son, holding the small, fragile body close to his chest, whispering that he would never let anything happen to him again. And in that dim bunker where the world felt narrowed to survival and strategy, every weak breath from Lucas echoed like the opening beat of a war that would soon consume the families above ground. Then Lucas slipped further, collapsing onto the cold floor, his small body trembling, lips blue, breath thinning into dry, broken rasping. Elena dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she placed her palm on his chest and pressed, counting each compression with precision taught by years of emergency work, though fear threatened to unsteady her. The bunker's stale air wrapped around them like a shroud as she breathed into his lungs, each breath an urgent plea against the void pulling him under. She looked into his half-open eyes, saw the flicker of desperation and the fading hunger for life, and whispered softly that he had to wake up, that he had to live, that his father and she would never let the darkness take him. Caleb stood beside them, fingers tight around his gun, though his entire being was chained to the rhythm of Lucas's failing heartbeat. Each breath Elena pushed, each compression, felt like his own heartbeat collapsing and restarting inside his chest. If Lucas did not recover within the next few minutes, nothing else, no evidence, no alliances, no strategies would matter. He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, voice deep and raw as he urged her to keep going, to hold him here in the world, reminding her that every second mattered. She nodded, her lips trembling but determined, pressing down again and again as she breathed for the child who had already survived too much. Time stretched into something suffocating, every drop of water falling from the bunker ceiling marking a slow countdown to the unthinkable. Elena did not blink, did not let herself imagine the worst. Her entire being narrowed into the fragile rise and fall beneath her hands. When Lucas began to twitch small, shallow convulsions, Elena gasped, her eyes burning as she held him steady, praying that this was life pulling him back, not slipping away. She pressed again, deeper, harder, her breath steady, her mind locked on the faint pulse fluttering beneath her fingers. Caleb hovered beside her, assisting when needed but letting her lead, knowing she had been the first to act, and the one who understood the boy's fragile body, with an intuition honed by fear and love. Lucas's breaths grew faint but present, the blue on his lips softening to a pale crimson, his fingers curling weakly in response to the compressions. Elena's sweat-soaked clothes clung to her skin, but she did not pause, whispering to him with every breath, telling him he was a fighter, that he would live, that they would take him out of here, that his father was right beside him. Caleb felt every tiny change, the rise of hope tangled with fear, knowing that if the boy could survive this moment, then Victor's and Sienna's plans would begin to crumble. The seconds dragged, Elena's arms trembling with exhaustion, but she pressed on, and the faint pulse grew stronger beneath her hand, until she could finally release a shaking breath of relief, though she did not stop monitoring him for even a heartbeat. Caleb squeezed her hand once, leaned close to Lucas, and whispered that he was coming back, that he needed to hold on to this breath, because they would take him away from this place, and no one, no enemy, no traitor would ever touch him again. Then, in the stillness of the bunker, in the midst of danger and desperation, Lucas let out a ragged gasp, a small but unmistakable sign of life, and the fragile glow of hope flickered back into the darkness as the sound of approaching conflict rumbled through the walls above them. Lucas lay on his back, convulsing in shallow bursts, his tiny frame shaking as his breath fought to steady itself, while Elena pressed once more against his chest with every last reserve of strength. Caleb stood like a shield over them, scanning every corner of the bunker, senses sharpened to a blade's edge. Leo checked the communication devices again and again, hands trembling with adrenaline but steady in purpose, knowing that each second delayed their escape. Outside, the metallic pounding of battering tools echoed through the passageways as Caleb's loyal men worked furiously to break down the eastern barricade, each strike against steel a promise of deliverance. Caleb leaned toward Elena, murmuring urgently for her to keep Lucas awake, to focus on the rhythm, assuring her that freedom was only moments away, and urging her to trust him. Elena nodded, eyes burning, hands relentless as she continued the compressions, whispering to Lucas that he had to breathe, that his father and Leo were opening the way for them. Every spasmodic jolt in the boy's limbs made Caleb flinch, his heart hammering as he tracked every sound inside and outside the walls. His men broke through one barrier, Then another, the screech of tearing steel, filling the bunker with the sound of war breaking open, while Elena fought desperately to pull Lucas back from the edge. And beneath her trembling hands, faint and fragile but steadying with every passing breath, Lucas clung to life. As Leo double-checked the equipment, his voice moved in steady rhythm through the earpiece as he updated Caleb that the rear exit of the bunker had been opened partway, but there were still about 5 meters of debris and broken concrete blocking a full escape. Caleb bent down, lifting Lucas into his arms, holding the boy close with one arm, while the other remained ready on his gun, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Elena stayed close, her hand supporting Lucas from the side, helping Caleb move step by careful step. The convulsions kept returning, each one stretching time thin, each second carrying the weight of a lifetime. And, Caleb murmured against Lucas's ear, "You have to live. Listen to Papa. We're getting out, I promise." Outside, Caleb's team broke apart enough rubble to create a narrow corridor, shouts and the clatter of falling material echoing in the confined space, but no one dared pause. Caleb gave a sharp glance to Elena and Leo, and they moved together, crouched low, weaving through jagged chunks of concrete and metal, each step measured to protect Lucas's fragile body. The boy continued to tremble, but his heartbeat had begun to steady thanks to the relentless chest compressions and breaths Elena had fought to give him. His eyelids still sealed shut, yet holding the faintest spark of life. As they neared the exit, the voices of Caleb's security team grew clearer behind them, calling out that the gap was finally wide enough for them to escape. Caleb lifted Lucas higher onto his shoulder, moving faster but still cautious, Elena staying right beside him, one hand on the boy's back, her eyes never leaving his face. Leo guided them forward, adjusting their pace with every shudder, every short breath, every new tremor that ran through Lucas's small frame. And then, after minutes that felt as long as years, they stepped out of the bunker into the harsh glare of flashlights, beams of light cutting across their sweat-streaked and dust-covered faces. And though exhaustion clung to all of them, one truth shone brighter than anything else. Lucas was alive, trembling and weak, but undeniably alive. Caleb's chest rose and fell in heavy breaths, yet his eyes burned with cold determination as he scanned the area, knowing this escape was only the first move in a war far from over. But for this moment, his son was safe in his arms. Holding Lucas tightly, Caleb walked out of the bunker, each step trembling yet unwavering, his clothes and skin covered in layers of dust that did nothing to dim the fierce resolve in his posture. Elena stayed beside him, one hand resting gently on Lucas's shoulder to keep him steady, her gaze fixed on the boy's faint breaths and the lingering tremors still shaking his small frame. Outside, Caleb's team had already prepared an ambulance, medical equipment spread out with military precision, their flashlights sweeping across anxious faces, a scene chaotic on the surface but moving with flawless coordination, every person adjusting their pace to the fragile rhythm of Lucas's heartbeat. Caleb lowered the boy onto the stretcher, while Elena and Leo worked to secure the monitors for pulse and oxygen, and Caleb leaned close, whispering into his son's ear, "You're going to be all right. Papa's right here. Everything will pass soon. Just hold on to your breath." The ambulance sped away, its engine screaming through the night as Caleb sat inside with Lucas, one hand gripping his gun as if shielding his son from every remaining threat, while Elena hovered near the boy's head, watching the monitors and giving breaths when needed, the siren slicing through empty streets like a desperate plea to keep the child alive. Lucas convulsed again and again, each tremor testing every skill and every fragment of experience Elena and Caleb possessed, his eyelids shut tight, but still carrying that thread of life. And Caleb refused to let go of him for even an instant, every weak heartbeat a stark reminder of the price of hesitation. When the ambulance reached the hospital, a fully prepared trauma team waited under harsh white lights, physicians and nurses standing ready with cardiac equipment, oxygen tanks, defibrillators, and emergency drugs, their focused exhaustion lining their faces. Caleb placed Lucas on the table, Elena at his side, breathless but refusing to step away. The doctor checked the monitor. It showed a chaotic, jagged rhythm ventricular fibrillation. Lucas's lips and limbs were ice cold, his body twitching faintly. Caleb stood over him, eyes locked on his son, his fists clenching so tight his knuckles whitened. The doctor prepared the defibrillator, attaching the pads to Lucas's chest. Caleb bent close, whispering, "You have to live. Papa and Elena are right here. Everything will be all right. Hold on. Elena pressed her hand to the boy's shoulder, murmuring, "Stay strong. You can fight through this." "Clear!" the doctor shouted. The first shock jolted Lucas's small frame, arching his back off the mattress before he slumped down. The monitor still showed the erratic, trembling waves. It wasn't stabilizing. "Charging to 200 joules, the doctor announced urgently. Caleb gripped Elena's hand tightly, his voice low. "It's all right. We try again. Don't give up." "Clear!" The second shock hit, a violent snap that echoed in the silent room. Lucas collapsed back down, limp and terrifyingly still. The room fell into a vacuum of silence, heavy and suffocating. Caleb stopped breathing, his eyes locked on the monitor, waiting for the chaotic waves to organize. Then a sharp, electronic beep pierced the silence. Caleb flinched. Everyone froze. A second passed, stretching like an eternity, before another beep followed, then another. The chaotic line spiked and slowly smoothed into a steady, rhythmic wave. Sinus rhythm established. The doctor exhaled, his voice losing its sharp edge as his shoulders sagged in profound relief. "He's back. BP is stabilizing." The strength left Caleb's legs instantly. He collapsed to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the sheets near Lucas's hand, his body shaking with raw, uncontained relief that broke through his iron exterior. The ruthless businessman, the feared figure of the underworld, was gone. In his place was just a father who had been staring into the abyss. He reached out, enclosing Lucas's tiny, cold fingers in his own trembling hands, pressing his forehead against them. "I'm here, Lucas," Caleb whispered brokenly, his voice thick with tears he could no longer hold back. "Papa is here. You're safe now. Just breathe for me." Elena wept silently beside him, her hand covering her mouth to stifle the sobs that racked her chest, while her other hand rested gently on Lucas's damp hair, stroking it soothingly. She watched the monitor through blurred eyes, confirming what her heart desperately needed to know. He was staying. Lucas didn't open his eyes immediately. The trauma had pushed him to the very heavy brink of unconsciousness, and his body was too exhausted to wake. For a moment, Caleb feared the damage had been too deep. But then, slowly, faintly, a miracle happened within Caleb's grip. Lucas's fingers twitched. It was weak, barely a flutter, but then a small, perceptible squeeze tightened around Caleb's thumb. He couldn't speak. His throat was too dry and his energy too spent to form words. But that tiny movement was louder than any shout. It was a promise, a tether connecting him back to them. He was alive. Suddenly, loud knocking and hurried voices echoed at the door, and Lucas blinked in confusion as Caleb rose to his feet, his eyes sharpening instantly as he braced for whatever danger might still be hunting them. The door burst open as a squad of armed FBI agents poured into the room, their commands ringing out. "Everyone on the ground now. We have control of the situation." Caleb lowered his gun with a firm, steady voice, though his eyes never left Lucas. One agent approached quickly, confirming. "All of Victor Moretti's operatives have been arrested at the site. None escaped. All documents, weapons, and communication devices have been secured." Elena held Lucas tightly, relief washing through her as she watched the FBI move with certainty, understanding that Victor's empire was collapsing in real time. Lucas looked around and saw familiar faces, Leo standing nearby, still gripping the vital files he and Caleb had fought to recover, his voice steady as he said, "Boss, it's over. Every piece of evidence is in our hands," and the FBI stepped in just in time. Caleb smiled faintly, resolve still burning beneath his expression as he turned to Lucas and said, "You were so strong, and now we can finally begin healing everything. No one can threaten you again." Lucas gave a weak but genuine smile, his eyes brightening with the survivor's glow of a child who had just weathered a storm that nearly swallowed him whole, and whispered, "Papa, I was so scared. But now I know I'm safe." The FBI continued sweeping through the room, checking and arresting the remaining loyalists of Victor, sealing off the entire space along with every piece of related documentation, their agents moving with swift, precise certainty, leaving no trace behind for any rebellious faction to reclaim. Caleb watched the entire process unfold, his hand resting gently on Lucas's shoulder, his gaze heavy with the understanding that from this moment forward, everything would change. Victor's power was broken. His network collapsed entirely, and now they could finally shift their focus to protecting their family. Elena whispered softly into her son's ear. You made it through everything, and now we're safe. No one can hurt you anymore. Lucas inhaled a shaky breath, his small body still trembling but with a steadier pulse and more even breaths, his eyes lifting to Caleb and Elena with a look full of trust and love, as he asked in a thin but certain voice, Papa, we won, didn't we? Caleb smiled, his vision blurring with emotion, as he whispered, Yes, my boy, we won, and from now on, you will never have to be afraid again. Elena placed a hand gently over Lucas's chest, feeling his heartbeat settling into a steady rhythm, her voice steady but full of warmth as she said, You survived everything, and we will never leave you. Everything has been taken care of. Victor's men have been arrested, his power shattered, and from now on, you can grow up safe. The three of them exchanged a long, silent look, the fear and chaos of the past hours melting slowly into the warmth of safety and hope, knowing they had crossed the edge of death and lived, that Lucas was alive and safe, and that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter where they could finally breathe freely after the nightmare they had endured. Victor Moretti stood alone in his luxurious office, his hand shaking around his phone as messages poured in from the families he once considered allies, each line cutting into his pride like a knife, as they demanded explanations about his betrayal, questioning his loyalty after the evidence of his plot to kill Lucas and manipulate Caleb had spread. He looked around the room, now eerily empty, his most loyal associates silent, their eyes lowered, too fearful to meet his gaze. The power he once held so firmly had turned to ash in a matter of hours. Years spent building his network of control and intimidation had collapsed all at once, every scheme exposed, and with the FBI arresting his most trusted men and sealing off every file, he had lost any ability to act. Victor slammed his hand onto the desk, his voice rising in a hoarse, powerless scream. How could this happen? They've all betrayed me, every ounce of power, influence, every long-term plan all gone in a matter of hours. He could barely process it. Every strategy he had built to destroy Caleb, control Lucas, and manipulate the families had become meaningless. Message after message declared that the families were pulling away, some even aligning themselves with the FBI, threatening to dismantle every piece of infrastructure and wealth he possessed, and the realization chilled him to the bone. Allies he once swore were loyal now stood firmly against him, warning that unless he removed himself or accepted total loss he would be isolated beyond recovery, his forces erased. Meanwhile, Caleb, Elena, and Lucas remained in the hospital, listening to updates from Leo and their contacts, knowing that Victor's empire had finally collapsed. Caleb exhaled, slowly, his expression solemn but filled with a quiet sense of justice fulfilled. Every piece of evidence they had gathered, every careful step from the bunker to the hospital had led to this moment, tearing down the manipulative empire Victor had built. Elena looked at Caleb, holding Lucas's hand as she whispered, At last, everything is right again. Lucas is alive, and Victor's plots have been exposed. Caleb nodded, his eyes still fixed on his son as he murmured, That's right, my boy. Everything has changed, and from now on, we can live without fear. Victor tried desperately to reach out to the few lieutenants he believed still loyal, but his calls failed one after another, communication lines severed, his allies refusing any contact, and every hope of regaining power slipping away like sand between his fingers. He stared out the window, rage and despair twisting inside him as he took in the view of the city he once dominated. The buildings, the streets, the world he controlled for so long now felt distant and unfamiliar, with no one left to fear him or take orders. His mighty network lay in ruins, families withdrawing together, the FBI securing assets and documents, and the influence that once made people tremble now reduced to memory. Caleb understood the gravity of the moment. This was the turning point. Lucas had survived, Elena remained by his side, and Victor's power had finally been extinguished. He looked down at his son and whispered, Papa kept you safe, and now no one can ever hurt you again. Every plot has been stopped, and Victor's reign has ended for good. Elena wrapped her arms around Lucas, her voice trembling yet resolute. You've survived everything, and now we can begin again, living safely, without fear. Lucas closed his eyes, exhausted but soothed in the embrace of his parents, a faint but real spark of hope shining through, signaling the start of a new life. While Victor stood in his office, hollow and alone, his strategies shattered, and his empire reduced to dust. The city now understood that Caleb had emerged as the protector, the victor, the one who had guided his family out of the shadows of violence and conspiracy, opening a new chapter of rightful strength and quiet hope. Morning sunlight began to filter through the hospital blinds, washing over the room where the storm had finally passed. Caleb stood by the window, watching the city wake up, his face lined with exhaustion but softened by a peace he had not felt in years. He turned to Leo, who stood quietly by the door waiting for orders. Caleb's voice was low but carried the weight of absolute finality. Dissolve the council, Leo. Liquidate the shadowy assets and sever every tie with the families. I don't care what it costs. I am done. From today, the Morgan name stands only for legitimate business. I will not let another drop of this world's poison touch my son. Leo nodded with profound respect, understanding that his boss was not admitting defeat, but choosing a victory far greater than power. He was choosing his son's life. Caleb then walked over to the bedside where Elena sat, her hand still resting protectively over Lucas's sleeping form. She looked up, her eyes tired but shining with a resilience that humbled him. Caleb knelt beside her, bringing himself to her level. You saved him, Elena. When my money, my guards, and my power were useless, it was your courage that pulled him back from the dark. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I spent my life building a fortress to keep him safe, but I realize today that a fortress is just a prison if there is no love inside it. I don't want to be the feared man on the eastern seaboard anymore. I just want to be Lucas's father, but I can't do it alone. I need you, not as a nurse, but as part of this family. Elena's breath hitched, tears prickling her eyes as she saw the raw vulnerability in the man who was supposed to be made of steel. She squeezed his hand back, her voice trembling but resolute. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. We will protect him together, not with fear, but with a home. Just then, Lucas stirred. His eyelashes fluttered, and he opened his eyes clearer now, the shadows of the trauma fading under the morning light. He looked from Caleb to Elena, sensing the shift in the air, the absence of the heavy tension that had always suffocated their home. In a soft, raspy voice he asked, Papa, are the bad people gone? Are we really safe? Caleb smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, brushing a hand through his son's hair. Yes, Lucas, the bad people are gone, and they are never coming back. I made sure of it. From now on, no more guards in your room, no more secrets, just us. Elena leaned in, wrapping her arms gently around the boy, her warmth shielding him. We are going to start over, sweetheart. A real life, just the three of us. Lucas looked at them, a small, relieved smile breaking across his face as he finally allowed himself to believe it. The room fell into a comfortable silence, filled not with the cold calculation of strategy, but with the warmth of a new beginning. Caleb stood watch over them, not as a warlord guarding a territory, but as a father guarding his world, knowing that while power could command fear, only love could heal the wounds of the past. The story of Caleb, Elena, and Lucas reminds us that family, devotion, and courage are among the most important values in life, and in the real world, we too must face trials that feel impossible to defeat. Holding on to love, protecting those we cherish, and trusting one another is the strength that carries us through every storm. We invite you to share your thoughts. Ask yourself what challenges you have faced in your own life, and how you found the strength to overcome them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can follow our daily uplifting videos, and please like and share so others may also hear and feel the emotion woven into stories like this. We truly hope to read your heartfelt comments, your feelings, your reflections, and the lessons you drew from this story, so we may connect through the sincere experiences that come from each person's heart. Lucas is now safe, their family reunited, and it was love, courage, and faith that brought about this miracle. Caleb held the hands of Elena and Lucas, smiling as he felt peace and happiness in each present moment, reminding us all that the true treasure in life is family, and the ones who stand by us when everything else falls apart. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video with more heartfelt, emotional, and meaningful stories. We wish all of you good health, joyful days, and a life filled with peace and positive energy. Goodbye for now, and see you again in our next videos.